On the evening of April 12, 2018, Morgan Hartley posted a photograph to Instagram. The image showed the sun setting over Joshua Tree's iconic rock formations, the sky bleeding orange and purple across the desert horizon. Her caption read, "Nowhere else I'd rather be." 7 hours later, both she and her sister Rachel disappeared. For 3 years, their campsite remained the only evidence. Tent zipped, belongings untouched, truck keys in the ignition. No footprints led away. No struggle disturbed the sand. The investigation turned up nothing. The desert had swallowed them completely. Then on June 17, 2021, Rachel Hartley walked into a highway rest stop 90 miles from where she'd vanished. She was barefoot, wearing clothes no one recognized. Her body carried dozens of geometric scars that medical examiners would later determine had been there for at least 2 years. Precise, identical, professionally executed. But what shocked the paramedics who responded wasn't the scars. It was her face. Rachel Hartley had been 22 when she disappeared. She should have been 25. The woman at the rest stop looked 40. Her skin had aged dramatically. Her hair had patches of gray. Her eyes carried something the first responder would later describe as a weight that didn't belong in someone that young. When authorities asked about her sister, Rachel spoke 5 words. She chose to stay. Then she stopped speaking entirely. About Morgan, about where they'd been, about the 3 years between the sunset photo and the rest stop. She became violent if questioned after dark, screaming to be released before sunset. Medical examination revealed her body had been sustained on a diet that left no identifiable trace in toxicology screens. The campsite had been preserved exactly as they'd left it. Morgan's sunset photo still glowed on her phone screen when investigators powered it on. Rachel now lives under a different name. She has never spoken her sister's name aloud since emerging from the desert. Morgan Hartley remains missing. This is what we know about the 3 years between the sunset and the silence. Rachel and Morgan Hartley were not inexperienced hikers stumbling into danger. Rachel, 22, was a geology student at UC Riverside. She had visited Joshua Tree National Park 6 times before April 2018. She knew its trails, its weather patterns, its dangers. Friends described her as meticulous, the sister who checked weather forecasts 3 times, who packed extra water, who planned every detail. Her backpack contained a first aid kit, topographic maps, and a satellite GPS device. Morgan, 19, was the artist. A photography major, her Instagram feed displayed hundreds of landscape shots. Death Valley at dawn, Big Sur's coastline, the Mojave at sunset. She'd been asking Rachel to take her to Joshua Tree for over a year. This trip was her idea. Her posts leading up to April 12th showed her excitement. Camera gear laid, out on her bed, a new hiking backpack, screenshots of weather forecasts showing clear skies. Their parents would later tell investigators that the sisters had grown closer after their father's death 2 years earlier. The camping trip wasn't just recreation. It was their way of processing grief together, away from phones and obligations and the weight of their mother's sadness. They were bonded, careful, experienced enough to respect the desert. On the afternoon of April 12, 2018, CCTV footage captured them at Jensen's General Store in 29 Palms. The timestamp reads 3:47 p.m. Rachel is visible, loading cases of water into their Ford Bronco, while Morgan stands at the counter, paying for supplies. Both are smiling. Morgan says something that makes the cashier laugh. Rachel adjusts her sunglasses and checks her phone. They look like hundreds of other visitors preparing for a weekend in the park. Nothing in their behavior suggests fear or hurry. The cashier would later tell police that Rachel asked about the best sunrise spots, and Morgan mentioned wanting to photograph the Milky Way. The transaction total was $67.34. They left at 3:52 p.m. Their park entry permit, time-stamped at the gate, shows they entered Joshua Tree National Park at 4:30 p.m. The permit listed their intended campsite as Jumbo Rocks Campground, a popular area known for its massive boulder formations and relatively easy access. Rachel had reserved the spot 3 weeks in advance. What happened over the next few hours has been reconstructed from digital footprints and physical evidence. They drove to their designated campsite, number 47, and began setting up. The tent they erected was a Coleman 6-person model, forest green, well used. Park regulations required they pitch it in the designated pad. Investigators would later confirm tire tracks and gear placement matched standard camping setup procedures. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was disordered. At some point between 5:30 and 7 p.m., they prepared a meal. The camp stove was found with residue later identified as dehydrated pasta. 2 plates sat beside it, both scraped clean. A small pot had been washed and placed on a rock to dry. At 7:15 p.m., Morgan posted her final photograph. The image shows the sky in full sunset glory, bands of orange, pink, and deepening purple stretching across the horizon. The silhouette of a Joshua tree frames the left side. The composition is perfect. Morgan had waited for the light. Her caption, "Nowhere else I'd rather be." Forensic analysis of the image's metadata confirmed it was taken from their campsite. The direction Morgan faced when she took the photo pointed northwest, toward a cluster of rock formations about 200 yards away. The timestamp embedded in the file, 7:15 and 3 seconds p.m. Within the next 8 hours, both sisters would disappear. No further posts appeared on either sister's social media. No texts were sent. The GPS device in Rachel's backpack recorded no movement after 7:43 p.m. Their phones, later recovered from the tent, showed no outgoing calls or messages after Morgan's sunset post. The last documented proof that Rachel and Morgan Hartley existed as free, living people in the normal world was that photograph. The desert at golden hour, a caption expressing contentment. Then, nothing. For 72 hours, their absence went unnoticed. They'd told their mother they'd be unreachable and would return Monday evening. Friends assumed they were off-grid by choice. The park receives thousands of visitors weekly. 2 more campers blending into the landscape raised no alarms. On the morning of April the 15th, a park ranger named David Chen was conducting a routine patrol through Jumbo Rocks Campground. He noticed the Ford Bronco in Site 47 hadn't moved since his previous patrol 2 days earlier. The truck was a distinctive burnt orange color, easy to remember. Chen approached the site at approximately 9:20 a.m. What he found would become the central mystery of the case. The tent was zipped shut. Inside, 2 sleeping bags lay unrolled but empty. A paperback novel sat open, face down, spine cracked to hold the page. Morgan's camera rested on top of her backpack. Both phones were powered off but undamaged. Rachel's wallet contained her ID, credit cards, and $140 in cash. Morgan's contained similar items, plus a photograph of the 2 sisters as children. Outside the tent, the camp stove and cleaned cookware sat arranged as if someone intended to return shortly. A pair of hiking boots, Rachel's size 8, were placed neatly beside the tent entrance. Morgan's boots were inside, tucked beside her sleeping bag. The Ford Bronco's doors were unlocked. The keys hung from the ignition. The fuel gauge showed just over half a tank. A road atlas sat folded on the passenger seat, marked with a highlighter route from Riverside to Joshua Tree and back. No blood, no torn fabric, no scattered belongings suggesting panic or flight. No footprints led away from the campsite into the desert. It was as if Rachel and Morgan had simply stepped outside their tent and evaporated into the air. Ranger Chen immediately radioed for assistance. By noon, the campsite was cordoned off as a potential crime scene. By evening, search teams were combing the surrounding area, but the desert held no answers. The investigation would eventually span 3 years, cover hundreds of square miles, and involve multiple agencies. It would turn up no credible leads, no witnesses, and no physical evidence explaining how two careful, experienced sisters could vanish from a locked-down campsite without leaving a single trace. Until June 17th, 2021, when Rachel walked out of the emptiness alone. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department took over the investigation on April 16th, 2018, approximately 30 hours after Ranger Chen's discovery. By then, the campsite had been photographed from every angle, the perimeter secured, and search teams deployed into the surrounding desert. What confronted investigators wasn't a crime scene in any traditional sense. It was a tableau of interrupted normalcy. Detective Laura Simmons, the lead investigator assigned to the case, would later describe it in her incident report as the most pristine disappearance scene I've encountered in 19 years of service. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing except the sisters themselves. The forensic examination revealed details that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Inside the tent, Rachel's sleeping bag was zipped halfway, suggesting she'd been lying in it recently. Morgan's was fully unzipped and pushed aside, the interior fabric still holding faint creases from body weight. The paperback novel, a thriller by Tana French, was open to page 247. Investigators checked. The book had 352 pages. Someone had been reading it and intended to finish. Both phones were recovered and sent for forensic analysis. Rachel's showed her last activity at 7:38 p.m. on April 12th. She'd checked the weather forecast for the following day. Clear skies, high of 78 degrees. Morgan's phone contained the sunset photo, posted at 7:15 p.m., and nothing after. No drafts, no unsent messages, no deleted content. The batteries were at 67% and 54% respectively when forensics powered them on. The GPS device in Rachel's backpack had recorded their movement through the park. The data showed they'd arrived at the campsite at 4:51 p.m., walked a short distance to gather firewood at 5:20 p.m., and returned by 5:35 p.m. The final GPS ping was at 7:43 p.m., placing Rachel within 15 feet of the tent. Then the device stopped recording movement entirely, not because it was turned off. It was still running when recovered. Battery dead. It simply registered no motion after 7:43 p.m., as if Rachel had become perfectly still and remained that way. Outside the tent, evidence grew stranger. The camp stove held residue later, identified through lab analysis as Backpacker's pantry brand Pasta Primavera, a common dehydrated camping meal. 2 plates showed scrape marks consistent with utensils cleaning them thoroughly. A pot had been washed, no food residue remained, and placed upside down on a flat rock to dry. A biodegradable sponge sat beside it, still slightly damp when investigators arrived 72 hours later. This suggested the sisters had eaten dinner, cleaned their dishes carefully, and set them out to dry. Standard camping protocol. Nothing rushed or abandoned mid-task. But here's where the physical evidence stopped making sense. Forensic teams combed a half-mile radius around the campsite, looking for footprints, disturbed vegetation, fabric tears on brush, any sign of passage. Joshua Tree's soil is sandy and loose in many areas, particularly around jumbo rocks. Footprints register easily. They found the sisters' tracks leading from the Bronco to the tent, tracks to the small clearing where they'd gathered firewood. tracks to a spot 200 yards northwest, the exact location where Morgan had stood to take her sunset photo, confirmed by matching the image's perspective. But no tracks led away from the campsite into the desert. The last footprints, Rachel's hiking boots, size 8, with a distinctive waffle tread pattern, circled the tent once and stopped at the entrance. The prints were clear, undisturbed. They simply ended, as if she'd stepped to the tent door and ceased to exist. Morgan's prints, from a pair of Merrill trail runners, size 7, ended near the rock where she'd apparently sat to photograph the sunset. Again, they simply stopped. No scuffing suggesting a struggle, no evidence of being dragged. The sand around both final print locations was smooth and untouched. Search and rescue teams arrived on April 16th and expanded the search grid. Volunteers combed the boulder fields. Helicopter overflights used thermal imaging to scan for heat signatures. Dogs trained in tracking followed the sisters' scent from their clothing, but lost it within yards of the campsite, circling in confusion before sitting down. A behavior handlers described as indicating the scent simply stopped existing in the air. No human can disappear without leaving a trace. People shed skin cells, hair, fibers from clothing. They disturb rocks, break twigs, leave compression marks in soil. Rachel and Morgan left none of this. The Ford Bronco deepened the puzzle. Keys in the ignition suggested they hadn't planned to go far. No one leaves keys accessible unless they're stepping away briefly. The fuel level meant they had the means to leave if they'd wanted to. The unlocked doors suggested they felt safe, unthreatened. But their wallets and IDs remaining behind meant they hadn't left voluntarily. No one walks away from their identity unless forced. Detective Simmons pursued the possibility of abduction. Joshua Tree's remoteness makes it attractive to people seeking isolation, including potentially dangerous individuals. But abduction scenarios require evidence. Tire tracks from another vehicle, signs of struggle, witnesses reporting suspicious activity. None existed. Park records showed no other vehicles entering or leaving Jumbo Rock's campground during the critical window of April 12th evening through April 15th morning. The nearest occupied campsite was 300 yards away, occupied by a family from Oregon who reported seeing and hearing nothing unusual. The family had gone to sleep around 9:30 p.m. on April 12th. The father, an attorney named Mark Pressler, told investigators he'd briefly stepped outside his tent around 10:45 p.m. to check on a noise, which turned out to be a jackrabbit, and noticed the Hartley campsite appeared quiet and dark. He saw no lights, no movement, no other people. It looked like they'd turned in for the night, Pressler stated in his interview. Just a normal camping scene. That sighting placed the sisters' tent as appearing occupied and undisturbed at 10:45 p.m. Yet at some point between then and Ranger Chen's discovery roughly 82 hours later, both women vanished, without disturbing a single item in their camp. Investigators tested for animal activity. Joshua Tree is home to coyotes, bobcats, and mountain lions. But predator attacks leave evidence. Torn fabric, blood, drag marks, scattered belongings. The campsite showed none of this. Moreover, large predators avoid humans and rarely attack groups. The idea that an animal could remove both sisters without a struggle, without blood, and without touching their tent or supplies defied all wildlife behavior patterns. The possibility of the sisters wandering off and becoming lost was examined and rejected. Rachel's experience in the park made it unlikely she'd venture out at night without preparation. The GPS device would have recorded movement if they'd walked anywhere. Their boots were at the campsite, Morgan's inside. The tent, Rachel's outside the entrance. No one hikes the desert barefoot. Environmental hazards were considered. Flash floods can occur in desert environments, but weather records showed no precipitation in the area for 3 weeks, before or after the disappearance. Sudden medical emergencies affecting both sisters simultaneously seemed implausible, and even so, wouldn't explain the complete absence of their bodies. By April 20th, 1 week after the disappearance, over 200 volunteers had searched more than 40 square miles surrounding the campsite. They found no clothing, no remains, no evidence of human passage. The investigation hit its first major wall. Every logical explanation required evidence that didn't exist. Detective Simmons expanded the inquiry. She investigated the sisters' backgrounds for any indication they'd planned to disappear voluntarily. Financial records showed no unusual transactions. Social media contained no cryptic messages or concerning contacts. Friends and family uniformly described them as happy, stable, and excited about the trip. Their mother, Rachel Hartley, told investigators that both sisters had planned to attend a cousin's wedding in May and had already purchased dresses. They were looking forward to things, Catherine said in her recorded interview, her voice breaking. You don't buy a bridesmaid dress if you're planning to vanish. The campsite was processed for fingerprints. Only Rachel's and Morgan's were found, exactly where they should be, on phones, water bottles, the tent's zipper, cookware. No unknown prints appeared anywhere. Investigators reviewed the sisters' cell phone records for the weeks before the trip. All calls and texts were to known contacts, family, friends, classmates. Nothing suspicious. No burner numbers, no encrypted apps. No deleted messaging history that might suggest secret plans or threats. By early May 2018, the active search was scaled back. The campsite evidence had been collected, cataloged, and analyzed. Every lead had been pursued to dead ends. The Hartley family held a press conference on May 8th, pleading for information. Catherine stood between framed photographs of her daughters, her hands shaking as she read a prepared statement. Rachel and Morgan are loved, she said. If someone knows something, please come forward. If they're out there, please come home. The press conference generated tips, dozens of them. All were investigated. None led anywhere. The case remained open, but went cold. Detectives had no evidence of a crime, no suspects, no leads, and no bodies. The official file listed Rachel and Morgan Hartley as endangered missing persons. Their case joined the hundreds of others who disappear in America's wilderness each year, many never found. Their campsite at Jumbo Rocks was released back to the park. Rangers cleaned it up, removed the tent and supplies, and turned them over to the family. The site returned to use. Other campers pitched tents there, unaware of its history. For 3 years, nothing changed. The case sat in a filing cabinet. The family waited. The desert kept its secrets. Then Rachel walked out, and everything investigators thought they understood about the disappearance proved wrong. For 1,127 days, the Hartley sisters simply did not exist. The initial search operation was immediate and massive. Within 6 hours of the Rangers' discovery of the abandoned campsite, San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department deployed ground teams into a 12-mile radius. By day 2, helicopters with thermal imaging cameras swept grid patterns over 200 square miles of desert terrain. Search and rescue volunteers combed through canyons, checked every known cave system, examined every water source within 20 miles. They found nothing, not a footprint beyond the campsite perimeter, not a shred of torn fabric on desert scrub, not a single heat signature that couldn't be accounted for. The FBI's involvement came on day 5, triggered by the possibility of abduction across state lines. Special Agent Carla Mendez took lead on what would become one of the most frustrating cases of her career. The Bureau brought resources the county couldn't match. Criminal profilers, advanced forensics, national databases. None of it produced a single viable lead, because the evidence told an impossible story. Two women don't vanish from a sealed tent without disturbing the zipper. They don't leave behind everything necessary for survival: water, food, identification, money, keys, as if these items suddenly held no value. They don't dematerialize from an area under surveillance by park cameras that captured no vehicles entering or leaving the sector during the relevant window. The Park Service reviewed every minute of footage from the 3 cameras covering access roads to that section of Joshua Tree. Between April 14th at 3:17 p.m., when the Hartley truck was confirmed entering, and April 17th at 11:04 a.m., when the Ranger arrived, exactly 17 vehicles passed through. All 17 were accounted for. None stopped. None showed signs of carrying passengers who hadn't entered with them. The FBI analyzed cell phone data for the last known pings from both sisters' devices. Rachel's phone last connected to a tower at 8:43 p.m. on April 14th. Morgan's at 9:02 p.m. the same evening. Then silence. No power down sequence. No gradual signal degradation, suggesting they'd moved out of range. The phone simply stopped transmitting, simultaneously, as if someone had removed the batteries at precisely the same moment. Except the batteries were still in the phones when they were found in the tent. The family hired private investigators after the first month. The Hartley parents liquidated retirement accounts to fund efforts that ultimately produced nothing the official investigation hadn't already explored. The private team's final report, delivered 4 months into the disappearance, was remarkable only for its honesty. We can find no rational explanation for the evidence as it exists. By month 6, the case began its slow migration from active investigation to cold case status. Not officially, the file remained open, the tip line stayed active. But the daily resource allocation dwindled. Search teams stopped deploying. The FBI redirected Agent Mendez to cases where evidence suggested something to investigate. The family refused to accept the silence. Rachel and Morgan's mother, Patricia Hartley, became a fixture at volunteer search events she organized herself. Every weekend for the first year, she drove to Joshua Tree with whoever would join her. Sometimes 3 people, sometimes 30, and walked the desert. She carried laminated photos, asked questions at every trailhead, every campground, every small desert community within 100 miles. No one had seen the sisters. No one had heard anything. No one could help. The theories multiplied in the absence of facts. Online communities dedicated to missing persons cases dissected every detail. Perhaps the sisters had been planning to disappear, and the camping trip was cover. But their bank accounts showed no unusual withdrawals. No hidden storage units were rented. No bus tickets purchased under their names or any known aliases. Perhaps they'd been abducted by someone already in the park. But no other disappearances clustered around that location or time frame. No reports of suspicious individuals. No similar cases that suggested a pattern. Perhaps they'd gotten disoriented and wandered into an area searchers missed. But both women were experienced desert hikers. They had GPS units, and the search radius had been extraordinary. Professional teams had covered terrain that amateur hikers couldn't accidentally reach. By the end of year 1, even the online theorists grew quiet. The case had no hooks to grasp, no suspects to investigate, no evidence trail to follow, just absence. The local news cycled through its annual anniversary coverage, each iteration shorter than the last. The first anniversary generated a 5-minute segment and renewed appeals for information. The second warranted 90 seconds. By the third anniversary, most stations ran nothing at all. Patricia Hartley still drove to Joshua Tree every April 14th. but the crowds of volunteers had dwindled to a handful of dedicated supporters. The searches had become memorial walks. Everyone understood they weren't looking for the living anymore. The case file, officially still active, sat in a drawer in the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. Detective Harding checked the tip line every few weeks, finding only the usual noise: psychics offering visions, conspiracy theorists offering elaborate scenarios, grief tourists offering nothing useful. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System maintained entries for both sisters, their photos, descriptions, and the circumstances of their disappearance existed in databases checked by medical examiners and law enforcement across the country. If remains appeared, if identification surfaced, the system would flag it. Nothing flagged. 3 years became the new permanent state of reality. The Hartley sisters were gone. The investigation was exhausted. The family was learning to live inside uncertainty that had no resolution date. Patricia still called Detective Harding monthly, asking if anything new had emerged. The answer was always the same, until June 3rd, 2021, when Harding's phone rang with news that made him question the previous 3 years of investigative work. Not because new evidence had emerged about the sisters' disappearance, but because one of them had just walked out of the desert. The 911 call came from a truck driver named Dennis Mora at 6:47 a.m. on June 3rd, 2021. He'd pulled into a rest stop on Interstate 10, 90 miles south of Joshua Tree National Park, to take his federally mandated break. The area was desolate, a concrete pad with restrooms and vending machines, surrounded by empty desert stretching to the horizon in every direction. Mora later told investigators he almost didn't stop. The place had an abandoned feel even in daylight. That's when he saw her. A woman sitting on the curb near the restroom entrance, barefoot, staring at the highway with what Mora described as the look of someone who'd forgotten what cars were. His first assumption was homeless transient, but her clothes were wrong: simple linen pants and an oversized cotton shirt, worn but clean, nothing like the layers of accumulated garments typical of long-term homelessness. And she wasn't asking for anything. She was just sitting, motionless. As the morning sun climbed, Mora approached, asked if she needed help. The woman turned to look at him, and he later testified that the expression on her face made him step backward. It wasn't fear or confusion, he told the responding officer. It was like she was looking at me from somewhere very far away. She spoke one word: water. Mora brought her a bottle from his truck. She drank the entire thing in seconds, then asked for another. And another. He called 911 after the third bottle, concerned she might be in medical distress. The responding paramedics found a woman in her apparent mid-40s, severely dehydrated but ambulatory, with no identification and no immediate explanation for her presence. She answered basic questions. Yes, she could walk. No, she wasn't in pain. Yes, she knew where she was, but offered nothing about how she'd arrived at the rest stop or where she'd come from. It was during the ambulance transport to Desert Regional Medical Center that one paramedic noticed the scars. They were visible on her forearms where the sleeves had pulled back. Geometric patterns of pale lines forming intricate, symmetrical designs. The paramedic, trained to document potential abuse, indicators, pulled the sleeve higher and saw the patterns continued up the entire arm, the same on the other arm. When they asked about the markings, the woman said nothing. At the hospital, a standard evaluation protocol triggered the involvement of law enforcement. Unidentified patient, possible trafficking victim, unexplained scarification, all red flags requiring the documentation. Deputy Maria Santos arrived at 9:15 a.m. to conduct a welfare check and attempt identification. The woman was cooperative but vague. She provided a name when asked: Rachel Hartley. Santos felt recognition flicker, but couldn't immediately place it. She ran the name through the system while a nurse conducted preliminary examination. The database returned a hit within 90 seconds. Rachel Hartley, missing since April 14th, 2018. Missing alongside sister Morgan Hartley. Case still active. Last seen Joshua Tree National Park. Santos looked at the woman sitting on the examination table. The missing person. Photo showed a 22-year-old with dark hair and smooth skin. The woman in front of her had hair shot through with gray deep lines around her eyes and the kind of weathered skin texture associated with decades of sun exposure. Santos checked the date of birth. If this was Rachel Hartley, she was now 25 years old. The woman on the exam table looked 45. Detective James Harding arrived at the hospital at 10:33 a.m., the missing persons file from 3 years ago open on his tablet. He'd worked the initial investigation. He knew Rachel Hartley's face. He also knew the mathematical impossibility sitting in front of him. He confirmed identity through a fingerprint scan. The match was absolute. This was Rachel Hartley. 3 years after vanishing from a sealed tent in the desert, she had materialized at a rest stop 90 miles away, aged beyond biological possibility. The medical examination revealed the extent of the scarring. Dr. Elena Vance, the physician conducting the evaluation, documented dozens of geometric patterns across Rachel's back, arms, and legs. The marks were uniform in depth and healing quality, suggesting they'd been created by someone with medical training or extraordinary precision. Forensic analysis would later determine the scars were at least 2 years old, meaning they'd been inflicted within the first year of her disappearance. Rachel submitted to the examination without resistance, but without engagement. She answered direct questions with minimal responses, yes or no, single words. She made eye contact rarely and spoke in a monotone that suggested either trauma or careful control. Harding waited until the medical team finished before beginning his questions. He'd conducted thousands of interviews. He knew how to approach someone in shock, someone traumatized, someone deliberately withholding information. He couldn't determine which category Rachel fell into. He started gently, asked how she was feeling, whether she was in pain, whether she needed anything. She responded to each appropriately, but offered nothing beyond what was directly asked. Then he asked where she'd been for the past 3 years. Rachel looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. I can't explain it in a way you'd understand. Harding noted the phrasing. Not that she didn't remember, not that she didn't want to say, that he wouldn't understand. He shifted approach, asked about the scars. Rachel glanced down at her forearms, the geometric patterns visible in the harsh hospital lighting. They're from there, she said. Nothing more. Where is there? Harding asked. The desert. Were you held against your will? A pause. Then, yes and no. Harding felt the interview slipping into abstraction. He needed concrete facts. He needed the one question that mattered most. Where is Morgan? Rachel's expression shifted. The distant calm cracked for just a moment, revealing something underneath that Harding later described as the deepest exhaustion I've ever seen in another person. She spoke 5 words, clearly, with direct eye contact, as if this was the only answer that mattered. She chose to stay. Harding asked her to repeat it. She did, identical phrasing, identical tone. He asked what that meant, where Morgan had chosen to stay. Rachel's eyes went unfocused. She repeated the phrase a 3rd time. She chose to stay. Then said nothing else. For the next 40 minutes, Harding attempted every interview technique he knew. Direct questions, sympathetic approach, firm insistence, gentle pleading. Rachel responded to questions about her physical state, her immediate needs, whether she wanted to contact her family. But any question about Morgan, about her location during the missing years or about the scars was met with silence. Not refusal, not distress, just a complete absence of response, as if those topics existed in a language she no longer spoke. The psychological evaluation conducted that afternoon noted selective mutism on specific topics and possible dissociative response to trauma. But the psychologist also noted something unusual. Rachel's silence seemed volitional rather than protective. She's not unable to speak about it, the report concluded. She's choosing not to. By evening, the hospital prepared to release her. There were no medical grounds for continued hold. She wasn't a danger to herself or others. She was legally an adult who'd committed no crime. That's when Rachel made her only demand. She needed to be released before sunset. When asked why, she said only, "I can't be kept inside after dark." The staff attempted to explain standard discharge procedures. That paperwork took time. Rachel's composure fractured. She became visibly agitated, checking the windows, watching the angle of light. When a nurse suggested she might need to stay overnight for observation, Rachel stood and walked toward the exit. Security was called. But before the situation escalated, Harding made a decision that would later draw criticism from his superiors. He expedited her discharge. At 5:43 p.m., 17 minutes before sunset, Rachel Hartley walked out of Desert Regional Medical Center. A social services coordinator had arranged temporary housing. Rachel accepted the information, then asked for directions to the nearest outdoor area. She spent that night, and many after, sleeping outside. Because whatever Rachel Hartley had experienced in her missing 3 years had left her with one absolute, non-negotiable requirement. She would not be enclosed after dark. Not in a building, not in a car, not in any space without a clear view of the sky, and she would never explain why. The medical examiner documented 43 scars. Each one was identical in dimension, precisely 2.3 centimeters in length, carved in straight lines at exact 90-degree angles, forming geometric patterns across Rachel's upper, back, shoulders, and the outer surfaces of both thighs. Under magnification, the edges showed characteristics of incisions made with surgical-grade instruments. Clean, deliberate, professionally executed. The scarring itself told a timeline Rachel refused to provide. Dermatological analysis dated the tissue reformation at a minimum of 24 months prior to her emergence, meaning whoever had done this to her had done it systematically over an extended period, beginning no later than mid-2019, a year and a half after she vanished, a year and a half before she returned. The patterns held no correlation to any known cultural scarification practices. Forensic anthropologists consulted on the case found no matches in global databases of ritualistic body modification. These weren't tribal markings, weren't gang symbols, weren't the chaotic evidence of torture or self-harm. They were something else entirely. Dr. Helena Voss, the forensic pathologist who conducted the examination, noted in her report that the precision suggested medical training. The consistency implied planning. The placement, avoiding major nerve clusters and vascular pathways, indicated knowledge of human anatomy. Whoever had carved these marks into Rachel Hartley's skin had done so with the care of a surgeon and the repetition of a craftsman. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the scars themselves, it was the healing. According to Dr. Voss's analysis, each incision had been properly cleaned and dressed during the healing process. No signs of infection, no keloid formation, no complications whatsoever. The wounds had been tended to with the same professional attention that had created them. Rachel had been kept somewhere with access to proper medical supplies, kept by someone who knew how to use them. kept alive and maintained while being systematically scarred in geometric patterns for purposes that remained utterly opaque. The toxicology report offered no clarity. Her blood work showed adequate nutrition, protein levels, vitamin markers, mineral content all within acceptable ranges, despite her severe dehydration at the time of recovery. Yet the isotopic analysis of her hair and tissue samples couldn't identify the source. She'd been eating something that sustained her, something that left no chemical signature matching any known food production system in North America. The investigative team brought in Dr. Marcus Chen, a specialist in nutritional forensics who'd worked cases involving long-term captivity. He spent 3 days analyzing the samples. His conclusion, delivered in a voice colleagues described as shaken, was that Rachel's diet had been chemically consistent but biologically unidentifiable. Her body had been sustained on something, but that something existed outside the traceable food chain. She'd been fed, scarred, healed, fed again, for 3 years. Somewhere within 90 miles of that rest stop, there existed a location, equipped for long-term human containment, a place with medical supplies and knowledge, a place where 2 sisters could be held beyond the reach of one of the most extensive missing persons searches in California history. And one of those sisters had been released. The other had not. She chose to stay. Rachel Hartley spoke this phrase 3 times in the presence of Detective Sarah Harding during the initial questioning at Desert Regional Medical Center. The interviews were conducted over 2 days in June 2021 in a private room with Rachel's court-appointed advocate present. The first instance came 40 minutes into the initial session. Detective Harding had established basic facts: Rachel's identity, her confirmation that she recognized her family members, her awareness of how much time had passed. Then came the question about Morgan. "Rachel, where is your sister?" Rachel's gaze, which had been unfocused and distant, sharpened. She looked directly at Detective Harding. According to the transcript, she spoke clearly, with no hesitation. She chose to stay. Silence. Detective Harding, following protocol for potential trauma victims, waited 30 seconds before responding. "Morgan chose to stay where, Rachel?" "She chose to stay." Same phrase, same inflection, no elaboration. The detective shifted approach. "Is Morgan alive?" Rachel's expression didn't change. She chose to stay. Then she stopped speaking entirely. For the next 6 hours of questioning across multiple sessions, Rachel responded to every other topic. She confirmed her name, acknowledged her parents, answered questions about her physical condition, cooperated with medical examinations. But any question relating to Morgan, to their time in Joshua Tree, to where they had been, met with absolute silence, not refusal, not "I don't know," not "I can't tell you," simply nothing. Dr. Alistair Finch, the psychiatric consultant assigned to evaluate her mental competency, termed it selective traumatic mutism with a single verbal anchor. Rachel's brain had locked down every detail of her missing years except for those 5 words, and those 5 words answered nothing. The phrase itself became the focus of intensive analysis. She chose to stay, not taken, not held, not trapped or kept or lost. Chose, active voice, implying agency, implying Morgan had been presented with options and selected one. But the phrasing also carried devastating ambiguity. Stay where? Stay instead of what? Stay under what circumstances? The investigative team dissected every possibility. If Morgan had chosen to stay somewhere, it suggested Rachel had been given the option to leave. Why would a captor release one sister but not the other? What kind of captivity allowed for choice, unless Rachel's statement was coded? A message she'd been instructed to deliver. Words implanted during 3 years of psychological conditioning, designed to mislead the investigation while protecting the location or identity of whoever held them. Or unless the statement was literal, and somewhere in the desert or beyond it, Morgan Hartley remained of her own volition. Which meant Rachel hadn't been held captive at all, at least not in any conventional sense. The lack of ransom demands supported neither theory. No contact had been made with the Hartley family. No requests for money, no political manifestos, no religious recruitment materials. If this was kidnapping, it had no apparent motive. If this was voluntary, it had no apparent logic. Detective Harding attempted one final approach during the last documented interview. She pulled up the photograph from the gas station, Rachel and Morgan smiling together, hours before they vanished. "Rachel, this is you and Morgan on April 7th, 2018. Do you remember this day?" Rachel looked at the photo. Her hands began to shake. Her breathing accelerated. The court advocate called for the session to end, but before she left the room, Rachel spoke one more time. Not she chose to stay. She said, "Don't look for her." Those were the last words Rachel Hartley spoke about her sister to anyone in an official capacity. She was released from medical custody 3 days later, on June 23rd, 2021, after her Sunset-related violent episode made continued hospitalization impossible. She entered a protected witness program under a new identity. Morgan's case remained open, but without Rachel's cooperation, without physical evidence, without any trace of where they'd been, the investigation had nowhere to go. The only person who knew the truth had built a wall of silence around it, and behind that wall, 5 words echoed, "She chose to stay." The medical examination of Rachel Hartley produced results that belong in a science fiction novel, not a case file. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead physician at Desert Regional Medical Center who oversaw Rachel's initial evaluation, noted in her official report that the patient presented physiological anomalies inconsistent with any known pathology or captivity scenario in my 23 years of emergency medicine. The toxicology screens came back clean, completely, impossibly clean. No drugs, no environmental toxins, no trace compounds from prolonged exposure to any specific location. Rachel's blood work showed standard markers for dehydration and malnutrition, but nothing else. She had been somewhere for 3 years, eating something, drinking something, breathing air from somewhere, and her body retained no chemical signature of any of it. The nutritional analysis produced results that shouldn't exist. Rachel was malnourished, her muscle mass had deteriorated, her body fat percentage was dangerously low. But the deficiencies were uniform across all nutritional categories: vitamins, minerals, proteins, fats, carbohydrates. She had been fed a diet that kept her alive, that provided exactly enough of everything to sustain biological function, but the analysis could identify no source material, no plant fibers, no animal proteins, no mineral content traceable to any geographic region. Dr. Marcus Webb, a biochemist consulted by the FBI, described the finding in a leaked report published by Wired as biologically inert sustenance. He wrote, "The patient's system shows evidence of sustained nutrition, but we cannot identify what provided that nutrition. It's as if she was fed pure energy converted directly to biological fuel, which is, of course, impossible with any known food source or supplement." The scars themselves presented their own medical impossibility. Dermatological analysis confirmed they were at least 2 years old, possibly older. The tissue had healed completely, with no sign of infection or complication. Each incision had been made with surgical precision, identical depth, identical healing pattern, identical geometric placement. Dr. Rodriguez's report noted, "The level of precision suggests medical training or access to specialized equipment. More disturbing is the pattern consistency across dozens of marks on different parts of the body. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic, methodical, and it would have required the subject to remain still or restrained for extended periods during the procedure and healing process. But the scars told only part of the story. Rachel's biological age didn't match her chronological age. She was 25 years old. She looked 45. Skin elasticity tests, bone density scans, cellular aging markers, all suggested a woman 2 decades older than her birth date indicated. The 3 years she'd been missing had somehow aged her body by 20. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a gerontologist brought in for consultation, found the results so unprecedented, she requested a second round of testing. The results were identical. Accelerated aging of this magnitude doesn't occur naturally, Dr. Tanaka stated in her evaluation. Even extreme stress, malnutrition, or environmental exposure wouldn't produce this effect. We're looking at something that fundamentally altered her cellular metabolism in ways I cannot explain. Then there was the psychological conditioning. Rachel cooperated with every aspect of her medical examination. She was compliant, calm, and responsive to all questions, except anything regarding her sister or her time in the desert. On those topics, she simply went silent. Not defiant, not emotional, just blank, as if a switch had been turned off. Dr. Alastair Finch, the psychiatrist assigned to her evaluation, diagnosed severe PTSD and selective mutism. But his report, partially obtained through FOIA requests, described something more specific than standard trauma response. The patient exhibits what I would characterize as trained silence, he wrote. This isn't suppression or avoidance. This is learned behavior, reinforced to the point of automatic response. When certain subjects are raised, she doesn't struggle to remain quiet. She simply cannot speak, as if the neural pathway has been disconnected. The most disturbing finding emerged during her first night in protective custody. As sunset approached, Rachel became agitated. She asked repeatedly to be allowed outside. When staff explained she needed to remain in the secure medical wing overnight, her agitation escalated to panic, then to violence. She threw herself against the locked door. She screamed. She clawed at her own arms hard enough to draw blood. 3 orderlies were required to restrain her until a physician could administer a sedative. The episode repeated the next night, and the next. Dr. Finch termed it acute sundown phobia, though he noted the name didn't adequately describe the severity of her response. The patient doesn't fear darkness, he wrote. She fears being contained indoors after dark. The distinction is critical. She needs to be outside, under open sky, when the sun sets. Preventing this triggers a fight or flight response so extreme it overrides all rational thought and self-preservation instinct. After the 3rd night, medical staff made the unprecedented decision to allow her outside access during evening hours, supervised but not confined. The violent episode stopped immediately, but the damage was done. The medical team concluded that Rachel could not be safely held in any indoor facility against her will after sunset, which meant protective custody was impossible. On July 3, 2021, 16 days after she appeared at the rest stop, Rachel Hartley was released. The FBI offered witness protection. She refused. She signed every legal waiver placed in front of her, accepted a victim services packet she never opened, and walked out of the hospital wearing donated clothes and carrying nothing else. She has not set foot inside any building after dark since. The medical file on Rachel Hartley is 1,400 pages long. It contains every test modern medicine can perform. It documents anomalies that shouldn't exist and conditions that can't be explained. But it doesn't contain the one thing investigators needed most, an answer to what happened to her. When conventional investigation fails to produce conventional answers, the human mind reaches for unconventional ones. The Hartley case generated dozens of theories. Some were grounded in criminal precedent. Others ventured into territory where evidence ends and speculation begins. A few went further still, into places most investigators refused to follow. But when every rational explanation has a fatal flaw, the irrational ones start to look less absurd. Theory 1. The Desert Cult. This was the working theory of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department for the first 8 months after Rachel's return. The premise: the sisters were abducted by a secretive, well-resourced group operating somewhere in the vast Mojave Desert. This organization practices ritualistic scarification and employs sophisticated psychological conditioning techniques. Rachel's scars are ceremonial markings. Her mutism is programmed silence. Her phrase, "she chose to stay," reflects Morgan's indoctrination into the group's belief system. The evidence supporting this theory is substantial. The surgical precision of Rachel's scars suggests access to medical knowledge or equipment. The systematic nature of the markings indicates ritual, not random violence. The psychological conditioning, the trained silence, the sundown phobia, demonstrates a level of behavioral control consistent with high control groups or cults. Law enforcement found precedent. In 1985, a survivalist cult in the Nevada desert held 12 members in isolation for 4 years. In 2003, a compound in rural Arizona practiced ritualistic scarring as part of their initiation rites. These groups existed undetected for years in remote locations. Joshua Tree National Park covers 1,200 square miles. The surrounding Mojave Desert spans 47,000 square miles. There are hundreds of square miles that are rarely, if ever, visited by park rangers or civilians. A well-hidden compound could theoretically operate for years without detection. Search efforts focused on finding this group. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept grid patterns across the desert. Satellite imagery was analyzed for structures or clearings. Tips from hikers and local residents were investigated. They found nothing. No compounds, no suspicious structures, no evidence of organized activity in any remote location that could have housed 2 women for 3 years. More critically, the cult theory fails to explain the medical impossibilities. No known cult practices produce untraceable nutrition. No psychological conditioning explains biological aging at 7 times the normal rate. And if Rachel escaped or was released by this group, why leave their carefully maintained campsite completely undisturbed as a false scene 3 years earlier? The theory accounts for some evidence, but not all of it. And in a case this strange, some isn't enough. Theory 2. The isolated captor. This theory posits a single individual or small group, someone living entirely off-grid, possessing unusual skills and knowledge, operating by their own incomprehensible logic. The desert attracts people who want to disappear. Hermits, survivalists, people who have rejected society entirely. Some of them have been out there for decades, living in caves or hand-built shelters, surviving on methods known only to them. In this scenario, the sisters encountered someone like this, someone intelligent enough to abduct them without leaving evidence, someone with knowledge of desert survival, makeshift medicine, and psychological manipulation, someone who kept them in a location so remote or so well hidden that 3 years of searching never came close. Rachel's eventual reappearance could have been an escape, or a calculated release, the captor deciding, for reasons unknowable, to let one sister go while keeping the other. This theory has the advantage of requiring no group, no organization, no infrastructure that could be detected. A single individual in the desert can vanish completely. They leave no digital footprint, no supply chain, no witnesses. But it collapses under the same weight as the cult theory. A lone survivalist doesn't possess surgical equipment or training to create those scars. A hermit doesn't have access to whatever sustained Rachel's nutrition in a way that left no biological trace. And no isolation, however extreme, explains aging someone by 2 decades in 3 years. The off-grid captor theory requires the captor to possess capabilities beyond what one person, however resourceful, could achieve alone, unless that person wasn't alone in the conventional sense. Theory 3. The fringe explanation. Joshua Tree National Park has a reputation. UFO sightings are reported there more frequently than in almost any other national park. Hikers describe feelings of missing time. Photographers capture unexplained lights in the night sky. Online forums devoted to high strangeness list Joshua Tree among locations with thin places, areas where, according to believers, the boundary between our reality and something else is permeable. The fringe theory isn't one theory. It's a collection of explanations that share a common premise. The sisters encountered something non-human. The most common version involves abduction by a non-human intelligence, what popular culture calls aliens. Though serious researchers in this space prefer terms like non-human entities or ultra-terrestrial intelligence. This theory attempts to account for everything the previous theories cannot. The lost time, the accelerated aging, the surgical scars as examination or marking, the untraceable nutrition as sustenance provided by non-biological means, the psychological conditioning as the aftermath of contact with intelligence so foreign that human minds cannot process it without breaking. And the phrase, "she chose to stay," takes on a literal meaning. Morgan chose to remain with whatever took them. Not because she was brainwashed, but because she was offered something, a choice, an opportunity, an existence that Rachel was not willing to accept. In this interpretation, Rachel's sundown phobia isn't random trauma. It's a specific fear, the fear of being taken again. Whatever happened to them happened after dark, and her subconscious will not allow her to be vulnerable in the same way again, trapped inside a structure when the sun goes down and the sky opens up. There's no physical evidence supporting this theory. There are no verified photographs of crafts above Joshua Tree on the nights in question. No other witnesses reported anomalous activity in April 2018. Rachel has never claimed to have been abducted by anything non-human. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, the believers say. And they point to one undeniable fact. Every other explanation has failed. The FBI investigated the cult angle for months and found nothing. The isolated captor theory requires capabilities no one person could possess. The evidence doesn't fit any known criminal pattern, any documented pathology, any precedent in the entire history of missing persons cases. So if the possible has been eliminated, what remains, however impossible, must be considered. Dr. Jacques Vallée, a computer scientist and UFO researcher, was asked about the case in a 2022 podcast interview. He said, "I don't know what happened to those sisters, but I know the evidence doesn't fit our current understanding of abduction, captivity, or human criminality. When you remove everything that can be explained, you're left with something that resists explanation. That's where the real mystery begins. The mainstream investigation does not pursue this angle. It cannot. Law enforcement deals in evidence, forensics, and criminal behavior. They have no framework for investigating the unexplainable. But online, in forums and discussion groups devoted to unexplained disappearances, the Hartley case is discussed almost exclusively through this lens. Because for those who follow these cases, the impossible explanation is the only one that makes sense. Rachel Hartley no longer exists, at least not under that name. In late 2021, 6 months after she walked out of the desert, she was granted a legal name change. The details are sealed. Her relocation was funded by her family and handled with the kind of discretion usually reserved for witness protection cases. She is believed to be living somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. That's all the public record will confirm. According to witnesses in her new community, people who've spoken to local reporters on condition of anonymity, she keeps to herself. She works remotely, keeps the blinds drawn, and is never, ever seen outside after sunset. One neighbor described her as a woman who looks like she's listening for something. Another said she has the demeanor of someone who survived something but didn't escape it. When asked for interviews, her answer is always the same refusal. No explanation, just no. The Hartley family, through a spokesperson, has asked for privacy, but continues to fund a private investigation into Morgan's disappearance. They have not spoken to Rachel in over a year. The reasons for that estrangement have never been made public. Morgan Hartley remains on the National Missing and Unidentified Person System. No remains, no clothing, no DNA. The case is classified as open but inactive. There is nowhere left to search. The desert has been combed. The campsite has been examined and re-examined. Every lead followed to its dead end. And so the question remains, hanging in the air like Rachel's 5 words. She chose to stay. Did Morgan Hartley make a choice? And if she did, what could possibly make someone choose to remain in a place that destroyed her sister? Rachel Hartley survived, but survival isn't the same as freedom. She lives now in a new place, under a new name, carrying scars that were made with precision and a silence that may never break. Morgan Hartley is still missing. The desert keeps its secrets, and Rachel keeps hers. Some disappearances end with answers. This one ends with a statement that raises more questions than it could ever resolve, because the most haunting mysteries aren't the ones we can't solve. They're the ones that were solved in places we can never go, by people who will never tell us what they saw. If this story affected you, or if you think it deserves to be remembered, consider subscribing. These cases need witnesses. Someone, somewhere, is still waiting for answers. Thank you for watching.